I never thought the sting of betrayal would come from my own family. But that night it did, and it cut deeper than anything I'd ever known. I was sitting at the long dining table in my son's house, surrounded by polished silverware, crystal glasses, and guests who laughed like they belonged there more than I did. I had brought the pie I baked that morning, its crust golden, but it sat untouched at the edge of the table, plain against the glossy cakes and catered tarts. I told myself it didn't matter, but then my daughter-in-law leaned across the table, her smile sharp as glass, and dismissed me in front of everyone. She called me useless, like my very presence was an inconvenience she had to endure. For a moment, the entire room shifted. Forks froze in midair. A few nervous chuckles escaped. And my son, my own son, said nothing. He looked down at his plate, as though silence was easier than standing up for me. I kept my back straight, pressing the napkin hard into my lap, willing my cheeks not to betray the heat rising in them. On the outside, I appeared composed, but inside, it felt like my years of sacrifice packing lunches, staying up late to help with school projects, stretching every dollar when times were lean, had been reduced to nothing more than a cruel punchline. As the evening dragged on, I watched everyone enjoy themselves, their laughter echoing while my heart sank lower. No one touched the pie. No one looked my way. I had never felt so invisible. When the night finally ended, my son kissed my cheek distractedly, his eyes already glued to his phone. She gave me a practiced smile, polite but cold. I stepped out into the night air, my breath visible in the cold, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I drove home. That was the moment I realized something had shifted. It wasn't just about one dinner or one cruel remark. It was about respect, the quiet respect that had slipped away when no one was paying attention. That night, I felt hollow. I knew the world inside my family had changed, and I wasn't sure if I would ever fit into it again. But the real pain came later, when the consequences of that betrayal followed me home. The morning after that dinner, I moved through my house as though I were a guest in my own life. The coffee pot sputtered and hissed the way it always did, filling the kitchen with its familiar aroma. But even that small comfort felt dulled, muted, as though grief had pulled a heavy curtain over everything. I poured the cup into Frank's old mug, the one with the small chip along the rim, and sat at the table where the sun should have felt warm, but instead seemed distant. I stirred sugar into the coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. And I thought about how many mornings I had done this same routine while the world still felt whole. I used to feel purpose in these little rituals. They grounded me, but now, each action felt hollow, like I was just passing time in a house that had grown too quiet, too empty. The silence weighed on me. It wasn't just the silence of a widow's home, it was the silence of being unseen. My children had grown, built their own lives, but I had been part of those lives every step of the way. I was the one who stayed up through nights of fevers, the one who taught them to tie their shoes, the one who scrimped and saved so they could have more than I ever did. And yet, somehow, the years of sacrifice seemed invisible now. At that dinner, I wasn't a mother who had given everything. I was a burden, an afterthought. As I walked through the house that morning, dust catching in the streaks of sunlight across the living room floor, I ran my fingers across the photographs on the wall. Smiling faces from birthdays, graduations, holidays, all moments where I had been the backbone. the one who held it all together. But standing there now, those frames felt like lies, reminders of a closeness that had quietly dissolved when I wasn't looking. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad night, just sharp words said without thinking. But deep down, I knew better. That sting, that humiliation, it wasn't new. It had been building in small ways for years. The dismissive remarks, the way decisions were made without including me, the sudden disinterest when I spoke about things that mattered to me. That night at the table wasn't an isolated moment. It was the clearest sign yet that something had been wrong all along. And for the first time, I began to wonder if what I had brushed off as thoughtlessness might actually be something far more intentional. Looking back, I realized the betrayal at that dinner didn't appear out of nowhere. The signs had been there all along, scattered like breadcrumbs I refused to follow. I suppose part of me didn't want to believe it, didn't want to imagine that the people I had poured my life into could treat me as disposable. But once the veil lifted, those moments replayed in my mind with sharp clarity. I remembered the time 2 years ago when my son and his wife asked me to contribute to their down payment. They had painted it as a way for all of us to be closer, for me to live with them instead of rattling around alone in my little house. I sold that home, the one my husband and I had built from the ground up, brick by brick, to help them. They called it an investment in family, but when I moved in, I realized the word family meant something different to them than it did to me. I wasn't a partner in their home. I was a tenant, tolerated because I had helped pay for it. Then there was the slow erasure. I'd noticed photographs disappearing, pictures of me with my son, snapshots of family trips, even the portrait of Frank and me on our wedding day. In their place appeared new, glossy images of just the two of them, smiling like I had never existed. I tried to brush it off as redecorating, but each missing photo felt like another piece of me quietly erased from the family story. There were smaller cuts, too. Moments when my daughter-in-law would offer kindness in front of others, only to sharpen her words when no one was watching. If I cooked dinner, she would gush over it to guests, but later whisper that my meals were too heavy, too old-fashioned. If I folded laundry, she would smile sweetly and then refold everything, muttering about how I meant well. Each act of help I gave became proof of how out of touch I supposedly was. And the money, always little requests that added up. A car repair that turned out not to be urgent, tuition help for classes she never finished, bills that somehow never got paid until I stepped in. At first, I convinced myself it was just life. Families help each other, don't they? But it wasn't help. It was a pattern. A steady draining of what little I had left, disguised as need. The more I thought about it, the more I realized these weren't random slights or careless oversights. They were pieces of a larger picture. The coldness at the dinner table, the missing photographs, the casual way they spent the money I had sacrificed to provide it all pointed to something deeper, something deliberate. That night, as I sat alone at my kitchen table staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, I felt the truth settle heavy in my chest. This wasn't just thoughtlessness. It was control. It was strategy. And if I didn't start asking questions, I feared I might lose more than just respect. I might lose everything I had left. I decided then that I couldn't afford to stay blind. If there was a scheme, I needed to find it. And the first step was to start digging quietly, carefully, but determined. Once I allowed myself to see the pattern, I couldn't sit idle any longer. My instincts, honed from years of teaching and managing a household on little more than willpower, told me something was deeply wrong. So I began to look, not loudly, not in ways that would draw attention, but quietly, like slipping into a role I'd never expected to play. I started with the stack of mail left unopened on the counter. Envelopes I had been asked to just leave alone because they were already handled. One evening, when the house was empty, I gathered them into neat piles and read every line by the soft light of a lamp. My hands trembled as I flipped through statements and bills, but the more I read, the less I doubted. Charges in my name that I hadn't authorized, accounts I didn't recognize, even a credit card tied to my social security number, something I never remembered requesting. At first, I thought I was mistaken. Maybe it was just a clerical error, a mix-up that could be explained away. But then I found the papers tucked into a drawer in the home office, beneath stacks of home project catalogs, legal forms, my signature, scrawled neatly in black ink, staring back at me. Except it wasn't my hand. The letters were shaped like mine. Yes, but too clean, too practiced, as if someone had copied me rather than written their own name. I sat frozen, staring at the page as the blood drained from my face. It wasn't just money. It was ownership. Property transfer documents I never agreed to. Shifting pieces of what little I still held, land my husband and I had kept for years, into my son's name, and from there, I could see where it was headed. All of it was being lined up like dominoes, ready to fall into someone else's hands the moment I was gone. For a long time, I just sat in that dim office, my heart thudding against my ribs, unable to move. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was real. It was written in ink, signed under my name, a lie wearing my identity. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back where I had found them. My hands were still shaking, but a strange calm settled in. If they thought I was blind, they were wrong. If they thought I was weak, they had underestimated me. It was clear I couldn't confront them yet. Not now. Not without a plan. If they had staged this much already, I would need to be careful. Very careful. That was the night I decided not just to survive, but to fight back. The discovery of those forged papers changed everything for me. I could no longer pretend it was just careless behavior or a string of coincidences. It was deliberate. It was theft, lined with betrayal. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't simply storm into the living room and demand answers. That would only give them time to cover their tracks. No, I had to be smarter. So I did what I had always done. When the odds were against me, I played small. I let them believe I was fragile, a woman too tired and too trusting to notice what was happening right under her nose. I smiled at my daughter-in-law when she offered help, nodded at my son when he brought up planning for the future, and even thanked them for their concern. Every word out of my mouth was measured, every look carefully softened, so they would think they still held the upper hand. But behind that mask of naivety, I began to build my plan. My first call was to an old friend, someone who had once been my student, now a lawyer in town. I remember sitting across from him in his office, the weight of my story hanging in the air. He listened, his brows furrowed deeper with every detail. Then he leaned back, his voice low, telling me that what I held in my hands, the forgeries, the accounts, was more than enough to spark a case. Together, we crafted a set of documents that looked genuine, but carried within them carefully hidden clauses. Clauses that would force anyone signing to legally acknowledge fraud if they tried to use them. I walked out of that office with a folder under my arm and a new fire in my chest. They thought I was their victim. What they didn't know was that they had already stepped into my classroom again, and I had 40 years of experience outsmarting students who thought they were cleverer than their teacher. At home, I played my part well. I acted forgetful, asked questions twice, and even let them believe they were gently guiding me toward security by suggesting more paperwork. When my daughter-in-law laid those documents on the table one evening, I pretended to hesitate, to fumble with my pen. She smiled, confident she was moments away from winning everything. And then I slid my own stack of papers forward. My hands trembled just enough to sell the illusion. She never looked close enough. My son never asked enough questions. They signed without knowing that in that single moment, they had confessed to everything, every forgery, every theft, every scheme. That was my second revelation, more powerful than the first the trap had worked. What they thought was their victory had just become the very thing that would undo them. I folded the papers, tucked them neatly back into my folder, and smiled warmly as if I had just agreed to everything they wanted. They had no idea the ground beneath them had shifted. What remained was the hardest part, the confrontation. I knew the storm was coming, and I was ready to meet it. The night of the confrontation came faster than I expected. My son and his wife had arranged a small gathering at the bank under the pretense of finalizing estate matters. They thought it would be a quiet affair, just signatures on paper. A polite nod from the manager, and my life's worth transferred neatly into their hands. What they didn't realize was that I had already rewritten the ending. I walked into that sterile office with my folder pressed firmly against my chest, my heart pounding, but my face calm. I let them speak first, watched as they eagerly laid out their version of the documents, each word dripping with condescension. They spoke as though I were fragile, as though I should be grateful for their guidance in my so-called golden years. I nodded, playing along, even feigned a shaky hand as though unsure of myself. And then, when the time was right, I set my folder on the table. I slid the stack of papers across, smiling faintly. "If this is what you need," I murmured, "then let's make sure everything is in order." They didn't hesitate. Their hunger for control blinded them. My daughter-in-law picked up the pen first, her eyes gleaming as she scrawled her name. My son followed, not even reading the fine print. The moment their signatures hit the page, the trap snapped shut. The lawyer I had brought in quietly stepped forward, his voice firm, explaining exactly what they had signed. The air in the room changed instantly. My daughter-in-law's smile faltered, her face draining of color as the words fraud and legal confession filled the silence. My son shifted in his chair, stammering, his bravado crumbling with every sentence. For once, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The strength came from knowing that the truth was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was there in black and white, undeniable, binding. They had been so certain of my weakness, so confident in their scheme, that they never saw the walls closing in around them. I stood then, gathering my folder, my back straight, my voice steady. "This chapter," I said softly, "does not end the way you planned." The bank manager sat stunned, the lawyer's words echoing. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I felt not invisible, but powerful. The fight was over. The victory was mine. In the days that followed the confrontation at the bank, the dust slowly settled, though the echoes of that moment stayed with me. My son and his wife no longer had the power they once wielded so carelessly. The documents they signed had already made their way into the right hands, and the lawyer assured me that what they attempted would not only fail, but would leave a record that could never be erased. Fraud has a way of speaking for itself when written down so plainly. There was no screaming, no dramatic collapse of family ties in public. The undoing was quiet but absolute. Their confidence, their little empire of control, was dismantled by their own signatures. I didn't feel joy in watching them squirm. I felt something steadier, something deeper. Justice. For the first time in years, I could walk through my home without feeling like a guest in my own life. I rearranged the photographs they had tried to hide away, restoring the faces of my husband, my children when they were small, and the moments that reminded me who I was long before anyone tried to erase me. I baked another pie one morning, not to impress anyone or to sit untouched on a polished table, but because I enjoyed the smell of butter and cinnamon filling my kitchen. I began to realize that dignity is not something others can grant or take away. It's something we must claim for ourselves. For too long, I had allowed their treatment of me to define my worth. That night at the dinner table, when I felt invisible, I believed them. But the truth is, I was never invisible. I was underestimated, and that underestimation became my greatest strength. What I learned is that betrayal doesn't just wound us, it also reveals us. It forces us to see who we are when the people we trust turn their backs. And in that reflection, I saw resilience I didn't know I still had. I won't pretend everything is neatly tied up. My relationship with my son is strained, and perhaps it always will be. That is its own heartbreak. But I also know that love sometimes means drawing boundaries, even when it hurts. Forgiveness may come in time, but trust will take much longer. Shh. What matters is that I no longer carry the weight of silence. I no longer shrink myself to make others comfortable. I know my worth, and I know how easily it can be forgotten if I don't protect it. So if you're listening now, and you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or underestimated by the very people you've given everything to please, hear me, your worth doesn't vanish just because others fail to see it. Strength can be quiet. Justice can be patient. But both are always within reach. And I'd like to invite you into this conversation. If this story touched you, if you've ever walked through betrayal and found a way to stand taller on the other side, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters here. Like this video if you believe in the resilience of those who are underestimated, and share it so that others who feel invisible can be reminded that they are not alone. Because sometimes the greatest victory is not in what we lose, but in what we refuse to let go of our dignity, our strength, and the knowledge that we are far more powerful than anyone ever imagined.